Good afternoon. My name is Richard Freeland. I am the former Commissioner of Higher Education in Massachusetts, the former president of Northeastern University, and a senior advisor to the CLDE Coalition. The focus of this session is on state systems of higher education, including both the 4-year and 2-year sectors, and specifically on the capacity of state system agencies to promote civic education at the individual colleges and universities that they oversee. I am joined on today's panel by 6 individuals who are well positioned to comment on the role of state systems can play in advancing the CLDE agenda. They are Rob Anderson, the president of SHEEO, the Association of State Higher Education Executive Officers, Nancy Shapiro, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Education and Research for the University System of Maryland, Jody Fissler, the Senior Associate for Assessment, Policy, and Analysis for the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, John Reif, the Director of Civic Learning and Engagement for the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education, Julie Hartley, the Associate Commissioner of the Utah System of Higher Education, and David Paris, a senior advisor to the CLDE Coalition, former vice president for academic affairs and professor of government emeritus at Hamilton College. I'd like to begin today's discussion by saying a few words about a new entity called the Multi-State Collaborative for Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement. The collaborative is being formed under the umbrella of the CLDE Coalition and with the sponsorship of SHEEO in partnership with NASH, the National Association of System Heads. The 4 states represented here today by Nancy, Jody, John, and Julie are all founding members of the Multi-State Collaborative, and Rob, of course, as president of SHEEO, is a principal sponsor of this initiative. In a moment, I will call on each of our panelists to speak about what their state system is doing to promote civic learning and why joining the Multi-State Collaborative made sense from their perspective. Those comments will be followed by a discussion of this new initiative led by David Paris, in which all of our listeners will be invited to participate. Before turning to our panelists, however, a brief description of the Multi-State Collaborative. This entity represents a voluntary coming together of system leaders animated by a shared desire to strengthen civic education among the individual public colleges and universities in their states. So far, 8 systems, 4 represented on this panel, plus Kentucky, Florida, Wisconsin, and Arizona, have signed on to this initiative, and several other states are considering joining. The full group of states will meet in the coming months, both in person and virtually, and will participate in SHEEO's National Policy Conference in Denver next August. The idea that has brought these states together is simple. Developing robust programs of civic education at the college level is not easy. There are questions about what such programs should look like within the academic curriculum, in the extracurriculum, and in off-campus experiences. There are questions about the proper role of state system offices, since instructional programs are typically the province of faculties at individual institutions. There are questions about how we measure civic learning among students in settings where programs and policies are in place to promote it. There is even the perspective in some quarters that civic education is more the province of K-12 education than of college. And finally, of course, there are substantive issues associated with what civic education should mean in today's highly polarized political environment. Against this background, the essential goal of the Multi-State Collaborative is one of mutual support among participating states as they address these issues. We hope to encourage each other, learn from each other, and ultimately help each other develop the most effective possible programs for the particular needs of each of our states. And we hope to do so in a way that bridges the partisan divides that could potentially hinder our discussion. Beyond such mutual support, we hope to demonstrate the viability of a strong role for systems in promoting civic education, and in that way become a force for advancing it in all 50 states. With that, I'd like to turn to Rob Anderson of SHEEO, who has been the prime sponsor of the Multi-State Collaborative, for a few words. And after Rob, I would ask Nancy, Jody, John, and Julie, in that order, to offer their thoughts without further introduction on this initiative from the perspective of their states. Rob?
Thanks so much, Richard. And I really appreciate all the effort you've put into gathering this group of states. It takes dogged determination sometimes, and your role as a campus leader and state leader, perfect blend of skills. And thank you so much, sir. As Richard said, I am the president of SHEEO. I've been in this position for about 5.5 years. And before that, I served in various state higher education offices for the 15 years before that. So that's the perspective most recently in my career that I've had to address a lot of issues from. And at SHEEO, we view ourselves as the promoter and the defender of these state roles within higher education, whether it be strategic or policy roles, but we fully realize that they can enact and scale change. And I think that applies when it comes to civic education and bolstering our understanding of these democratic values and what it can do for all of us. And we acknowledge and we understand how much expertise and wisdom is represented on campuses, and how so much at the core of what is going to get done, it starts there. That's that genesis. We also believe that states coming together and collaborating with teams can lift up the best ideas for scalability, and that's critical to us moving forward if we're going to have meaningful change. Now, at SHEEO, we're used to working in this type of a format. We've developed a model that we call communities of practice, where we'll often come together for very specific topics with groups of state teams to work inter-teams and intra-teams, as well as to be sprinkled with some outside national expertise. And we've done this around degree pathways, state financial aid offerings, data visualization, and we're about to look at state funding for higher education and bring together 10 to 15 teams for this conversation. So this model is not one that's foreign to us, and I think a lot can be gained from it. How this is different, though, is really having to really step back at that macro level and think of items such as the public good of higher education and civic learning and democracy. I wrote a column about this last month, and historically, higher education, it's been assumed to be a public good. The research bears out the robust civic learning and engagement results, the positive gains in graduation, social responsibility, career preparation, and addressing the needs of underserved populations. But somewhere along the way, we've lost that narrative. It can be assumed no longer, and action is required. Within this approach, there are tangible gains for both state and student in areas we should strive to enhance no matter what our state politics are, as Richard referred to. Undoubtedly, approaches will vary depending on state and institutional context, but we need to discuss, develop, and implement approaches to civic learning that better clarify possible productive paths forward. We at SHEEO are supporting these expanded conversations by joining in with this conversation with like-minded organizations and endorsing these work, and we plan to be in attendance at this. We hope to raise awareness and begin to address this polarization that has permeated how higher education is viewed by many. The collaborative aims to build our capacity to tackle some of these urgent public problems and to create a stronger bond between students, institutions, and the communities in which they reside. We all desperately need connection that extends beyond our own individual interests. Our well-being and the health of our democracy require it. It is our hope that the work of the CLDE Collaborative will provide states and institutions a forum for open dialogue regarding some of these fruitful paths forward. And I understand fully that sometimes getting off ground zero can be a difficult task. When you look ahead, things can appear overwhelming due to the enormity of what lies ahead, as well as all the other responsibilities, a lot of them statutorily mandated, that lie in front of state offices and what they have to do on any given day, particularly within legislative session. But what we're trying to do here is break down some of these walls and get beyond some of those barriers and find some states who are willing to roll up their sleeves and tackle the problem today. This coalition of the willing will pave a path for those who follow. I'm very excited about where we sit right now in this conversation taking place today, knowing that we're going to have this convening in a few months. I look forward to your involvement, your participation, and your helping us prepare this path as we serve our students more fully moving forward. Thank you.
Richard, you want me to get started?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rob. That was beautiful and very inspiring, because those of us who work at systems sometimes feel like we're the invisible worker bees. We just sort of like, there's the faculty and there's the programs and there's all the stuff going on at campuses, and then we're staff, we're system staff. And the question is, what's our value add? That's the question the state legislature asks too, and the universities ask, what's our value add to the, the institutions and to the mission? But you've sort of laid out a really wonderful perspective. I think that what we're trying to do with respect to the multi-state collaborative, I love your vision of the teams, the way the teams of state systems and state SHEEOs come together to address the big problems, not necessarily solve them, but address the big problems. And there isn't a bigger problem in my mind than ensuring that the next generation coming up has the tools, the knowledge, the willingness to participate and preserve the democracy, the democracy that we enjoy right now. It's not so clear that that is going to be the case. And so we have a lot of responsibility. I want to talk briefly about Maryland, because Richard and Rob gave you a really good overview of the nature of the multi-state collaboration. The university system of Maryland has 12 public universities, ranging from the flagship, the University of Maryland College Park. Around the state, we have small universities at Frostburg, way out in the west, close to Pennsylvania and West Virginia. We have Salisbury out on the Eastern Shore and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. We have 3 historically Black universities. We have large institutions, urban institutions in the state. We have an extremely diverse system. And that gives us tremendous opportunities to move important things forward at multiple levels. So I wanted to describe briefly about how the Maryland system embraced the CLDE commitment and signed on to be a part of the multi-state coalition. So when we signed on to the multi-state coalition, there wasn't a multi-state coalition yet. There were maybe 2 institutions or 2 states that had sort of decided that this was something that was in their wheelhouse. And we are, together we're trying to build out and be a magnet. The USM Board of Regents tasked a work group to come up with a report to find out what is the status of civic learning and civic education and civic engagement across the system. What does it look like? And what are some recommendations that we could make to improve it? So that's the very first thing I would say is a really strong value add for systems. If you can get your governing board to be interested in this topic and start looking at the institutions and what they're doing, you learn a lot. You learn the associations they belong to, you learn the courses they're offering or the programs or the service learning options. And you bring together a lot of ideas that are homegrown ideas. So I was responsible for that, that task force. And we came up with some really, some big picture recommendations. We recommended, a big picture recommendation, foster an ethos of civic engagement and participation across all parts of the institution and throughout the educational culture. And then we gave some examples of what to do, encourage Carnegie community engagement classification. These are things that the institutions could do to demonstrate that they're doing that work. And the second big recommendation was identify civic literacy as a core expectation for all students. So for the work I do at the system level, I bring together faculty and students and staff to try to define what are the things that would count as civic engagement activities for a campus, so they could get credit for that when the Board of Regents says, what are you doing? And what are the things, how do we define civic literacy so that, again, we can assess whether our institutions are doing it and whether, sorry, our students are gaining that competency. So in the work that Maryland is doing right now, we have a student civic leaders group committee nominated by the provosts and vice presidents for student affairs in all of our institutions. So I have 12 universities have nominated these students to be part of our civic literacy, our civic leaders committee. We also have staff at every institution. We actually have a voting coordinator who is every institution has to have a voting coordinator by law. So the voting coordinators are part of my team, and we create opportunities for those people to get together, move this agenda forward. That's an example of how the Maryland state system is embracing this civic learning mission. And I'll stop there. And I just want to say to everybody, I have another meeting that I have to go to. It's actually the National Association of System Heads, where I'm going to be talking about CLDE at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to leave it a few minutes early from this session. Thanks.
My name is Jody Fissler. I'm, as Richard said, I'm with the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, where I work as the Senior Associate for Assessment Policy and Analysis. I don't think I can improve upon anything that has been said already about the philosophical foundations for CLDE and the importance of this work. So I will talk a little bit about the context in Virginia and how we're involved and why we thought it was important to be involved in this multi-state collaborative. In Virginia, our agency, SHEV, is a coordinating agency, not a governing agency. And what that means is that all of our four-year institutions are independently governed. We have 15 four-year institutions that, like in Maryland, are very diverse. They include urban and rural HBCUs, a military academy or military institute. They quite run the gamut. And then we also have 1 2-year transfer institution and then 23 community colleges. And those 23 community colleges are organized into a capital S system. They are 23 institutions with a single state board for the community colleges. But all of those institutions are under the umbrella of the State Council of Higher Ed. And so there are a lot of different types of institutions and organizational structures that we are working within. As far as the coordinating agency, our authority, we have very limited authority for what we can do. And if it's not listed in the Code of Virginia as a responsibility of the agency, then we don't get involved in the institution's business. So sometimes I talk about our approach is, we are by necessity a group of loose parts flying in formation. And, our agency is just trying to keep all the parts essentially flying in formation. So Rob mentioned Coalition of the Willing. That's very much how we operate in Virginia, especially if it's something that, I think it may actually be stated somewhere in the code that we are expected to work with the institutions on any policies that affect them. And then in turn, they are expected to do what we say. regarding those policies, but it is collaborative at its very core. So the reason that we were able to get into civic engagement in the first place, and our involvement in this actually predates the multi-state collaborative, as Nancy said, was because one of the duties of SHEV is that we work with the institutions to establish guidelines related to the assessment of student achievement. And when I first started at SHEV in 2016, the strategic plan that the State Council had created for Virginia made two specific references to civic engagement and to preparing Virginia's graduates for success in the workplace and in civic engagement. I was asked to revitalize the state's assessment policy as one of my first work projects when I started. And I looked at that strategic plan and I saw those two references to civic engagement as guidance from the council that they thought this was an important thing for us to be working on. And so we built it into the assessment policy. I worked with a very large task force of institutional representatives on crafting that policy. And everyone agreed that yes, because it was in the strategic plan, we needed to take this seriously. And we built it into the policy. So civic engagement became one of the required competencies that all public Virginia institutions are required to assess in some form or fashion. Now, putting it in the policy, we still respect, one of the things that we were really careful about was trying to respect that line between being directive and being too flexible. So we needed to strike the right balance. We needed to respect institutional autonomy and the very different contexts that our institutions are working in, the different student populations that they serve, and give them the flexibility to implement the policy on, in its entirety, not just with civic engagement, but the entire policy in a way that made sense for them, while also trying to give us a North Star, like we're all moving in the same direction, but you can all do it in your own way. So it's been tricky. And I think some people would say that we've erred on one side or we've erred on the other side. And maybe we haven't gotten quite the balance quite right, but essentially that's where we are. So I view my role, I don't believe that you just ask people to assess something without then also helping them to do the work that then leads to the assessment. So that has led to me kind of creating opportunities for the institutions to come together, share what they're doing, learn from each other, to talk about how are you defining it, how are you delivering on the educational experiences, how are you assessing it. And then we can try to come together around some, maybe coalesce around some good practices. I won't say best practices because I think that's also somewhat context dependent. So it's very invitational. The way we work with our institutions is generally very invitational. I see the multi-state collaborative as taking that invitational approach to an even higher level. We are able to come together as states, and in our states, we've got different political contexts, we've got different organizational structures again, and yet there are definitely things that we can learn from each other. John and I had a wonderful conversation at the AAC&U annual meeting that I continue to think about for days afterwards, that has helped to inform how I'm looking at this work. And I do believe that when you get smart people in a room together working on a common problem, that magic can happen. I believe Matt Reed, who blogs for Inside Higher Education, called it curated serendipity. And that's what I see as the promise of the multi-state collaborative, is that we can create more opportunities for that curated serendipity to happen, excuse me, so that we can all advance the goals that we agree are important. So I will leave it there and turn it over to John.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Nancy and Rob and Richard, for kicking this off to this point. I'm John Reif. I'm Director of Civic Learning and Engagement for the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. And I'm so delighted to be here in this virtual room with all of you right now. I would like to share two of the main elements of our work in Massachusetts on civic learning and democratic engagement, and speak just a little bit about what I hope for from this multi-state collaborative. The first main element I'd like to talk about is the focus on civic learning that really jumped off in 2012 under the leadership of Richard Freeland as our commissioner at that time. And Richard worked with the board to help them adopt a strategic priority of preparing citizens. And then they realized they had to think about, what does that mean? They asked a study group to help them figure out, how would you measure success if you're preparing citizens? And I was invited to be part of that study group. Study group met for over a year. We made a report. That report crystallized then in a board policy in 2014 on civic learning. And that policy called on all of our public institutions to involve all of their undergraduates in civic learning. And there was a definition of civic learning that was acquiring the knowledge and the skills that people need for informed and effective participation in civic and democratic life. And it also involved acquiring an understanding of the political and social values that underlie democratic structures and practices. So the board called on all of our institutions to involve all their undergraduates in this learning through the classroom, through the co-curriculum, and through engagement with communities beyond the campus. And then the department realized that if the campuses are being asked to do this, that it would be useful to have a staff member at the department who could work with people on the campuses to help them implement this policy. And I was then invited to become the director of civic learning and engagement in 2015 to work with the campuses. And since that time, I've been working largely with the champions on the individual campuses for civic learning and civic engagement, consulting with them, helping them run faculty workshops, bringing them and their faculty and their staff together in cross-campus groups and small and large convenings to think through, what does this work require of us? What does it look like? So that's one element. The second element I'd like to focus on is the step that our Board of Higher Education took in 2018, looking at data that showed that Black and Latinx students were enrolled at lower percentages than white students, were retained at lower percentages, completed their programs and degrees at lower percentages. Even when the data were controlled for economic factors, the board decided to make racial equity its top policy and performance priority for the public system. And since that time in 2018, a number of different initiatives have rolled out to help the system actually do this. And the most recent piece that has rolled out is a 10-year plan, a strategic plan for racial equity that defines these differences in what happens for students, not as achievement gaps of the students, but as institutional equity gaps. That the institutions are failing their Black and Latinx students by not doing whatever is needed to ensure that they are succeeding at rates commensurate with their white counterparts. And so, among other things, as this strategic plan is being rolled out, I have the opportunity to make connections between this core commitment to racial equity and the already existing commitment to civic learning and civic engagement. And so I'm working with my folks on the campuses to figure out, how do we braid together these two commitments, civic learning and engagement and racial equity. And one of the things that we're working on is a rethinking of civic learning outcomes with explicit attention to racial equity. When the work that was done 10, 12, 15 years ago that I was part of that involved the Crucible Moments chart on page 4, student civic learning outcomes. And we adapted and adopted that in Massachusetts. Looked at now from my perspective is pretty white. And so the question is, when we think really about students carrying racial identities that really matter, how do we need to rethink what we want them to know and be able to do? So we're working on that. We're also working on sharing that, and I want to put into the chat an event that we are organizing on March 31st, a hybrid, so it's both place-based and virtual, symposium on anti-racist civic and community engagement. And I want to invite everybody here to register for that and come. You can come virtually. And part of what we'll do at that event is talk about this project of civic learning outcomes viewed through a lens of racial equity. And we'll then take what we learned from that discussion and from other sources and bring it into faculty and staff development in a series of summer institutes that we'll run this coming summer. So what do I hope for from the multi-state collaborative? I hope, I love, Jody, what you said about curated serendipity. I hope that we'll have a lot of that we will stumble into discoveries with each other, that we'll share information and perspectives, and we'll discover things by putting our heads together. I also hope that we will share resources with each other. This symposium is one example of a resource we're working on for us, but I want to share with you. And I suspect that each of our systems will be generating things that we could share across our systems. And it's also conceivable that we might figure out some ways to generate some resources together for our campuses. I would love to see us do that as well, so that we could tap some national funders who could say, this is important to us too. Let's give you some money to pass on to your campuses and help them do this work. So that's where I'll stop, and I'll pass it to you, Julie.
Thanks, John. So I'm Julie Hartley, Chief Academic Officer from the Utah System of Higher Education. So some background on us: we are a governing board that has just merged 2 different systems of higher education. So the degree granting colleges and universities were merged with the technical colleges, and technical colleges in the state of Utah offer technical certificate programs. They do not offer associate's degrees. They don't offer general education programs. So merging those 2 systems, a clock hour based type of institution with credit hour, and trying to create a happy family between the 2 different types of institutions. Shortly after our merger, the 16 institutional presidents decided as a body that they wanted to participate in this initiative and in the Civic Evidence Project that is related to this work that is being spearheaded by AAC&U. That has created some special challenges for our technical college institutions because a lot of the work that goes on around civic learning and democracy engagement, the way we traditionally think of it, happens through academic programming or general education courses. And so trying to figure out how we make that work for technical colleges that are prohibited by law from offering general education is an interesting challenge. And they also don't have the same types of student services and extracurricular activities that we associate with colleges and universities, but we are dedicated to making it work. And so one of the approaches that we're taking, one of the reasons why we want to participate in this project, is we have this strange climate, a political climate in Utah. We're an extremely red state, but one that highly values higher education for the personal development that it brings to individual students, and also because it has contributed to our very robust state economy, but kind of a schizophrenic attitude about, yeah, but it might undermine some fundamental conservative values, and so therefore it's dangerous. So we have a high level of state support and also a high level sometimes of state suspicion of higher education, and it's a balancing act that we're trying to walk. Our legislators are very enthusiastic about the fact that our institutions are adopting this focus on civic engagement, and so we see that as a very promising thing. So where we are right now, we had 3 institutions who had joined on to the AAC&U Civic Evidence Project way back when it first started, I believe in 2019. Our other institutions are now on board and working towards completing the collection of project artifacts and other things as part of that project. We're very enthusiastic about what this might yield, especially in terms of outcomes for our technical colleges. And so that could be a very exciting research component. We've also had 6 of our 8 institutions that are degree granting institutions receive the Carnegie classification for community engaged institutions. And we are hopeful that all 8 of those will get them through this effort being part of our new strategic plan. One thing that I think Utah has that's really interesting is we have a state law that requires us to provide a civic learning component within general education at all of the degree granting institutions. And we love that particular state law. So it requires all students receiving a degree from a public college or university to have an understanding of fundamentals of history, as well as the principles, forms of government and economic system of the United States. So all of our degree granting students have that as a requirement for their degree programs. We see that as a good start, but we view civic learning, democracy engagement, and especially community-based engagement and experiential learning as high impact practices that all students should have multiple encounters with. And so we do have this general education component, but we would like to embed capstone projects and other high impact practices related to civic learning within all of our degree programs as much as possible, and where it can't be specifically focused on civic engagement, at least community engagement with the disciplinary topic at hand. So right now we are working together among the degree granting institutions to figure out how we embed that within degree program pathways so that our underrepresented students don't have to opt in. It's structured in for them, so they don't have to have the right cultural capital to know to ask about getting these experiences. We will be automatically providing them for them because we also have equity, racial and economic equity as one of our top strategic plan priorities for this new board. One of our biggest challenges, honestly, is that my office and my staff are very limited. So post-merger, the academic affairs staff in our system office was cut in half. So we're trying to do the work with half the staff, and then we have multiple new initiatives coming on board. I see a lot of you nodding because you have been in similar situations. So I honestly don't have time to do the high level thought that is required for a project like this as the system lead. And so I shamelessly borrow good ideas from other states. And I see that as one of the values of a multi-state collaborative and of organizations like SHEEO and NASH, is that we don't all have to reinvent the wheel. We can take what's working someplace else and adapt it for our particular needs. So that's kind of where we are in the state of Utah right now, is trying to figure out all the different flavors of civic learning and what that means for different institutions of different institutional types, how to make that equitable for our students, and then moving forward towards things that will be embedded in policy like degree structure and other types of mechanisms. And one of the other issues that we're working on right now is how do we flag these experiences through our registration system so that we can track and see whether students are actually getting the advantages that we want them to have from our degrees. So I'll stop there.
Wow, if I can say. I'm David Paris. I'm a senior advisor like Richard in the coalition, the CLDE Coalition. And I want to start just by thanking everybody for their presentations. This has been really instructive to me, as well as I think very hopeful, very hopeful. I want to encourage folks in the audience, who I also thank for coming, to feel free to ask questions in the chat. I want to start the discussion though with some combination of an observation and a question. What's striking to me in the presentations we saw is a kind of parallelism among them. You set down a marker or an edict or a directive or something between an absolute mandate, which is not a word not a thing you can do in higher education. You can, but you're looking for trouble. And a kind of loose consensus building operation whereby people, this is a good idea, let's explore it, let's get committees together, let's develop at various levels, at Rob's level, communities of practice around certain issues. At each of the states level, it seems, I love Jody's phrase about flying in loose formation in the same direction. That plays on what are plausible, persuasive kinds of values. Yes, this is, when you say it about civic education being something that higher education should engage in, it seems, oh, sure. But you had to say that because it wasn't always the case. And now in your states, you've been working at this for a while at one level or another, and it's bringing it along. So at least part of what I think is in front of us, and I think Rob has addressed this pretty well about communities of practice, is how do we get other states to start taking those first steps? And attached to that is another question, just as keeps coming back in my mind in all these discussions, and it's about polarization and partisanship. That is, in our first discussions, and still with others, the sense that this is going to be seen as a blue state plot against America, to put it in its worst case. And I'm really thrilled to hear that Florida is interested. And I wonder how long that will last, and how we and Julie particularly could probably offer us some advice about how to move this initiative in a red state. So that's a kind of tangled question, but I do want to note, I wanted the observation to be noted that we do know how to move things forward in higher education, despite appearances, and change in higher education, despite appearances. And that one of the functions that this collaborative will do is unveil the mechanisms from SHEEO. I mean, it's almost a Russian doll thing. What's happening at the state level is mirrored at the SHEEO level, about how we can do this so that more and more people get involved and we move it forward. And particularly, I think the emphasis on evaluation, on actually taking inventories and saying, how far is this going and how do we know if we're doing it well, is very, very important. But I would like you to comment on my observation, but also comment, if you're willing, on the question of in a partisan environment like we are in, with colleges and universities under attack, how do we navigate the almost certain prospect that it will be criticized as something that's partisan, that this whole coalition is on the left of the political spectrum and it's partisan. And John, you might comment on that too, because if you were in Florida and you said, we're going to talk about anti-racism, I doubt you'd get applause from the political class, and as I said, Julie's probably navigating these waters too. Anyway, let me stop there and kind of open it up, and I'll be paying attention to the chat. And if people want to raise their hands, I hope I will catch you. But I wonder if each of you, or if you wish, take a shot at what I've just said about some combination of mechanisms and the partisan question.
So I'll
John,
take,
have you gotten any push? Oh, no, go ahead, Nancy.
so I'll take the first shot because then I'm going to have to jump off. But I actually question your premise. I
Okay.
think that we should not assume that any investment in civic work is partisan. I think we should assume the opposite. I think that if we approach it as if it is partisan, it will become partisan. I think Florida is a really good example. I will also give you an example from the Maryland State Legislature today. I mean, a bill was dropped yesterday. It was about creating a civic seal for high school students and high schools in Maryland to get a civic seal that they have done certain things to encourage civic learning. For us, this is K-12 schools. Was proposed by a Republican in our state legislature.
Mhm.
I think we have to be sensitive to the language we use, but be inclusive. And I'll let John address the equity issues because I think they're real. But the inclusivity of, the other piece of this is we can't let conservatives usurp the commitment to patriotism. You know, the notion of, and I made this reference in the panel earlier. There's a PACE report that came out about language, and they said that language really matters. That Republicans and conservatives think of patriotism when liberals think of activism, and you can actually use them simultaneously, and you should use them simultaneously. When you talk about activism, you should say patriotism, because they are two sides of the same coin. If you're actively engaged in protecting democracy in whatever way, that's patriotic, And so I think that we just have to, reading that PACE report, which was really interesting about language and is one thing. The other thing that report said, which was that civic doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Some people think civic as local, my civic council, my civic, and they think of it very community-based. And others think of civic as, the broad American civic, reality. So finding your way on that continuum, I think, will help bridge the gap between red and blue. And I think we need to do that.
No, let me correct myself if I gave the wrong impression. I'm not assuming it's partisan. I think that there's a danger that others will assume that it's partisan right out the gate. And I think you've done a very eloquent job of saying how to negotiate that, or at least start negotiating it. There was a question in the chat that I think Richard might address, to the extent that he feels comfortable doing so, about what's going on in Florida, as Florida was mentioned as showing an interest in joining the collaborative. Richard, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that, because it's interesting, and I think relevant to what was just being said. Florida has developed a very strong mandate for civic education in its public colleges and universities. That mandate has two components. One is every student is going to be required to take a course. And I'm a little hazy about this, but I think the course is perhaps not specifically designed, but broadly scoped out in state regulation. And then individual campuses need to offer it to all their students. If there's anybody in the panel here or listening that has better information than I have, please jump in. But there's a second component too, which is that every student is going to be required to pass a test, a state-developed test, which has been developed by, as I understand it, the university faculty in Florida, an 80 or so item test about civic knowledge. So it's a very strong requirement for civic learning, coming from a place of a very, a very passionate commitment in the importance of this. There may be and almost certainly will be, questions of interpretation, particularly about, some aspects of American history, I assume, for example, or maybe, some aspects of what the Constitution has to say on certain points. But that's coming within the framework of folks who are deeply committed to promoting civic learning and encouraging civic participation on the part of their graduates. So I do think we're going to have to find a way in this discussion, because it's clear that just from what one reads in the papers, that there are also issues in Florida connected with this that are potentially going to be at odds with what some people around the country in this movement think. We're going to have to work very hard to figure out things we can agree on, things which we can mutually say yes to, and maybe things where there's some disagreement, maybe some factual issues where there's some disagreement, that we can park and figure out, come back to after we've, established a little more basis for mutual understanding. I think to the point that if we can start with the assumption that we're all patriots here, we all care about the country, we're all passionate about this, passionate enough to disagree about it sometimes, and then work very hard to get to yes on as many aspects of it as we can, and agree to come back to those things that divide us and figure out why they divide us. And to some extent, I think those things are probably going to be factual. And we can get at them that way. But this is, I think, if we can find a way to keep everybody at the table and to get higher education into position not to be on one side of a cultural divide, but to be bridging the cultural divide, we will have accomplished something very, very important for this country. And I think that is part of what I hope we can do.
That's great, Richard. Thank you. John, you had your hand up.
Yes, I put my hand up when you asked the question of us as a panel, and Jody did also. Her hand was up before mine.
Jody, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I put my hand down because I thought Richard was expressing what I was thinking already very well. But this is one of the things that I'm most excited about with the MSc. I think that we have such an opportunity to do a great service to the field and to the country if we can actually be a place where some of those issues can be dissected, where we can tease out semantic differences or political rhetoric from actual genuine disagreements, and to take some of those disagreements head on and talk about what are the things that we actually disagree about, and are there places even within those disagreements where we agree on things and can work and find common ground. That's going to be so essential, and I'm really looking forward to that aspect of the collaborative.
Thank you, John.
Okay. One of the questions you directed to me, David, was what about equity and this question of division in points of view? And one of the pieces that I think was really important for us in Massachusetts was that we started by looking at data. What happens to our students? When you disaggregate the success statistics, the enrollment, retention, and graduation statistics by race, what do you see? And what we saw was that at every level, Black and Latinx students were represented in smaller percentages of their population than all students, or specifically white students. And we then asked, what would we see if we refused to blame the students for these disparities? What would we see if we asked our institutions to claim some responsibility for not serving all of their students equitably and meeting their students where they are, recognizing who they are, recognizing the strengths that they bring with them and the assets, as well as the challenges that they may be facing. And that was the foundation for our system's commitment to equity. And I think I think that's an important piece of the picture, is that you do need data. You do need to stand on data as you are figuring out what to do. I also think that local contexts do matter. The fact that in Massachusetts, we have the opportunity to explicitly claim racial equity as a goal for public higher education means that you don't have to make that claim in your state, but we could have a conversation about what does it look like when we've made that claim and we're trying to figure out how to live it out. And so having the opportunity to stand on what you claim and then have conversations across those differences, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think especially, I think, as I said before, the role of data in these discussions and evaluation, how well are we doing? What exactly are we doing? And assessment is really, really important. Wonder if we have a fairly large audience. Wonder if anyone out there would like to jump in. No hands raised. Richard, do you want to sum up, or Rob, or both, kind of where you see we are and what the next steps are for the collaborative?
Go ahead, Richard. I think that would be you as far as those details. The only thing I'll add to what my great colleagues have already said is I don't think it's often that we don't have big and bold enough ideas. We have to build a big enough table for people to sit around and to have them. And I hope that's what we can do through some of these collaboratives.
Well put. Richard, you get the last word.
You're on mute, Richard.
You're on mute, Richard.
Where am I here?
There you are.
Okay. Let me say thank you to everyone on the panel who has spoken today and everyone in the audience who has come and participated and listened. I think just listening to this conversation, one can see the potential value in the kind of interactions that we are anticipating in the multi-state collaborative. Each one of the states that reported, each one of the 4 states that reported, is obviously a very different situation, coming at this from a different place, emphasizing different things, addressing different challenges, operating in different political environments. And there's already been some learning taking place, as we can see, among the participating states in this discussion. So I am greatly encouraged about the potential of the multi-state collaborative to enhance everybody's ability to promote civic education effectively. In that context, let me invite, if there are anyone in the audience representing a state system that has not yet gotten engaged or discussed with us the multi-state collaborative, please do reach out to me. My email address is r.freeland@northeastern.edu. r.freeland@northeastern.edu, Northeastern as in the university. And I'd be happy to interact with you and brief you on what's going on and consider your potential participation. I do think it's important that we break up in time for everybody to get back to the plenary. I know there's some interesting discussions still to be had. So let me once again thank our speakers, thank all members of our audience. I have learned a great deal from this. I hope others have as well. And we have a long road to go here before we accomplish our objective, but this is certainly an important step forward. Thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.